very much. Last talk, we're all tired. Hopefully you'll be entertained a little bit. In 1974, the space probe Voyager 1 launched into the galaxy, carrying the story of life on this planet. In the remote chance that anyone's out there, Voyager carries greetings in 55 languages, music from Bach to Chuck Berry to whale songs, stories of cells and human reproduction, and 116 color and black and white images. For Voyager, the next nearest star and potential friendly face is still 40,000 years away. I can tell you these Voyager facts because when I was a kid, I was a nerd, and I knew everything there was to know about Voyager. And I stared at the images that Voyager carried over and over again. One image, the one on the screen right now, is particularly captivated by. Now, some people say this image went to space, this image from the 1957 Trans-Antarctic expedition, which clearly shows this enormous snowcat dangling over an icy crevasse. This image went to space because it shows humanity's desire for dangerous exploration. But I knew that this image went to space because it also shows one of the key components to life on Earth. Glaciers. If you're into glaciers, this is the place in the solar system to be. We have over 400,000 glaciers and ice caps, some 5.8 million square miles of glacial ice. Glaciers grow on all 7 continents. They're in the Arctic, Antarctica, they're in the Middle East, they're in Central Africa, they're along the equator. Glaciers are exceptionally diverse, fluctuating in multitudes of ways to local, regional, and global environmental dynamics. The majority of what we know today about glaciers comes from the physics and chemistry of glacial ice, its composition, its dynamics, the impacts of ice on landscapes. This tells us about key glacier mechanics like ice mass reduction and recession rates. It also tells us about climate change. In 2009, James Baylog stood on the TED stage and he showed image after image after image of ice materially retreating, visual evidence that climate change is happening and that human beings are transforming Earth's systems. Today, glaciers are widely narrated as the most visible manifestation of global climate change. But here's the problem. In this rendering, in this story of glaciers, they're simplified. They are reduced down to bodies monitored, measured, and controlled, known only for their relation with climate change. In the articulation of some scientists, glaciers, they are just ice. So this is the idea that I want to offer you today, that glaciers are more. They are more than the summation of their parts and processes. That glaciers have rich social and cultural context, and that today they are deeply controversial. Think about all they do. Glaciers regulate global climate. They build and shape vast landscapes. They provide water and other essential resources. They also stimulate art and literature. They drive tourist economies and community livelihoods. Everywhere on this planet that glaciers are located, they are located in historic and inhabited environments. Where there are glaciers, there are people, and the two have been interacting for the entirety of human history. But we know so little about them. Everyone in this room today, we have grown up being taught, question everything. Critically examine what assumptions you have, what biases you have. Think about how place, space, and time matter. But for glaciers, we have been given this single story, and largely we have not questioned it. So how do we begin? How do we move forward? Earlier this year, my colleagues and I at the University of Oregon, we suggested a new approach to glaciers, a feminist glaciology. Now, by feminist, I don't just mean analyzing women and other marginalized people and how they compare to men within glacier sciences. That is part of the story I'm going to tell you tonight, but it's not all of it. By feminist, I also mean beyond gender. I mean looking at all knowledges from all people, this equalization of how people in ice interact. And I will tell you that a feminist lens is crucial, because the majority of glaciological knowledge that we have today stems from knowledge created by men about men within existing masculinist stories. Let me give you some examples. Early glacier science wasn't tied to field data. It was more tied to gendered concepts of masculinity. When debates about glacier motion emerged in the early half of the 19th century, two central protagonists, David James Forbes and John Tyndall, they competed for scientific credibility by pinning their theories on their reputations as manly mountaineers. Forbes, he said glaciers are these semi-fluid bodies, and he pointed to all his years of fieldwork in the ice. But Tyndall, check out that beard, he said glaciers are solid. And he pointed to his numerous first descents and all these other stories of his heroism, all the risks he had taken. And unsurprisingly, he triumphed. The scientist that was the most masculine at this time was deemed the most socially credible. And this is actually common throughout the history of glacier science. Men dominated the field through the 19th and 20th centuries. What ended up happening was there was this single narrative that was masculine, Eurocentric, and white that overlooked and or disregarded the ice-related knowledges of women, of Indigenous First Nations people, and other marginalized people. Let me give you another example. To do glacier research in the ultimate glacier, the ice sheet in Antarctica, researchers had to be authorized to do so by a committee, and for decades, only men were authorized. American women broke this barrier in 1969 when they sent an all-female team, two of whom were pictured on the screen, from Ohio State. British women, they didn't fare as well. They weren't allowed to go to Antarctica until 1980s, and they weren't allowed to overwinter until the 90s. One of the premier female glaciologists of this time, Elizabeth Morris, she was appointed head of the Earth Science Division of the British Antarctic Survey years before she was ever actually allowed to go to Antarctica. And when she finally did in 1987, she first had to go around, quote from her, and speak to the other researchers' wives to ensure them she would not hit on their husbands. Such sexism and masculine dominance has not disappeared from glacier sciences as society has modernized, even though today there are more women in glacier sciences than there were since about the 70s. Here's a quantitative look. On the screen, you're looking at the publication rates for two premier academic glacier journals. Male publication is in gray, female publication is in black. We look at a chart like this, and what we can see is that in about the 50s, women authored about 4% of all the articles. That number jumps in the 90s to about 10%, and then in 2000, just below 20%. Another way to think about that is that over 50 years, that's an annual increase of 0.3%. So there are a few more women in glaciology. But really, what do percentages like this even tell us? Measuring a woman's involvement in glaciology by tracking her published literature, this only gives us metrics for those playing the game. It doesn't tell us anything for those who aren't. It doesn't tell us about those who have left glacier sciences because of the academic leaky pipeline. It doesn't tell us about those who are approaching glaciers from the humanities or the social sciences. It doesn't tell us anything about local knowledges, and it doesn't present to us diverse glacier stories. Let me give you an example of what we're missing. On the screen right now is the Karakoram mountain range outlined roughly in red. The Karakoram is heavily, heavily glaciated, and people and ice have been living in contact with one another for centuries. In the early part of the 20th century, when European explorers came through, they asked the villagers they met, "What's that glacier called? What's that glacier called?" The villagers responded, "Well, that one's maiden. That one's woman. That one's male." In this part of the Karakoram, villagers have long identified a range of gender possibilities for glaciers. On the screen right now, you're looking at a male glacier. Male glaciers are characterized by moving slowly, don't give off a lot of water, they're often dirty, covered in rocks and soil. Now this is a female glacier. Female glaciers, they move quick, they give off more water, they're usually blue or white. Gender identification is crucial in this part of the Karakoram because here villagers breed their own glaciers. They take the seeds from male glaciers, like they're doing on the screen right now, they combine them with seeds from female glaciers, and they make a brand new glacier. Some glaciers are farmed for just a couple of years, and some are farmed for centuries, all to provide stable water in the dry season, but also for protection. Villagers tell stories that when Genghis Khan's raiders were coming through, villagers protected themselves by filling valleys full of glacial ice. So what does this feminist lens for glaciology do? Well, right off the bat, it expands our potential knowledge, and this has wide-ranging impacts. Why does it matter that there are people farming glaciers? Well, think about that in today's context. There's a program in India called the Ice Stupa Project, which has translated this technology onto a community level, and people are growing their own artificial glaciers as one solution towards water insecurity. What other solutions are out there if we start looking at people and ice together? What complexities are we missing? What stories are we missing by not looking? Let me give you another example. In 2015, I lived on the south coast of Iceland doing my doctoral work. And people used to tell me over and over a very simple story. Here goes, it's very simple. They used to say to me, in the 9th century, when Iceland was first settled, the glaciers are smaller than they are today. Then they got bigger, then they got smaller. The ice, it oscillated back and forth, back and forth. That's the story. It's very simple, but it tells us a lot because depending on social and cultural context, each time I was told that story by a different Icelander, they narrated the meaning of that ice change differently. Some said to me, the ice, it's always advanced and retreated. What is happening today, it's very natural. There is no link with climate change. Others said to me, the ice has always advanced and retreated. What is happening today is unprecedented. Who will we be as Icelanders without our ice? How really can glaciers be so darn simple if people extract entirely different meanings, codes, signals from them? The important takeaway for you is to think about that Western scientific glacier facts are just as much a body of stories about ice as stories from the Karakoram or stories from Iceland. But the problem is that we are losing these stories. They are held up continually against this dominant single story of ice. And this, to me, is very scary because we can't lose our glacier stories. They tell us who we are and where we're coming from and where we're going. They tell us alternative ways of interacting with the environment, different ways of having a worldview that doesn't look like yours. These stories, they teach us about power. They teach us about inequity. They make us reconsider what knowledge actually is. And this can be really terrifying for some people. Let me give you a last example. So in 2015, my colleagues and I, we thought about this, and we recently this year published in an academic journal this new approach to glaciology. And the response we got back from the media, it was swift, and it was unkind. Our work was misrepresented. It was mischaracterized. Pundits accused us of writing a hoax paper. They said we were saying glaciers were sexist. They said we were misusing government funds, and that was all in the first couple of days. Because once the internet discovered that I was a woman, I started to get messages, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of messages, none of which are fit to be shown on a TED stage today. But I'll give you a quote from one, then we'll move away. And the rest of the messages were much more personal. I have a hard time looking at them because they make me sick. In public, my colleagues and I, we were harassed and mocked for saying that there's more than a single story of ice, but in private, I was sexualized and demeaned for saying that there is more than a single story of ice. And what I will tell you is that ever since I was a kid looking at those Voyager images, I have been fascinated by ice, and I have traveled all over the world to the most amazing glacierized landscapes, alongside men and women, explorers, scientists, artists, and I have never been more aware of my gender than during this time of harassment and hate because of our work. So I can tell you now a little bit about single stories, about common representations that strip us down to bodies monitored, measured, and controlled. I stayed silent during this harassment. I went for walks, I deleted the messages. My colleagues told me, just ignore it. Implicit here is this new truth that attacks like these are common. They happen to other scientists, they happen to men, they happen to women, professors, students. This is modern academia. It's also, as we now know, modern America. And I pretended at the time that it did not bother me because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I showed how this bothered me, how I couldn't get it out of my mind, I couldn't work, I couldn't write, I couldn't sleep, how it kept bothering me, I was afraid that people would see that and they would think I was vulnerable to more attacks, or that maybe there was truth in these attacks. Or maybe they would think that I wasn't strong enough to be an academic, to be a scientist, and do the work with glaciers that I love. And I will absolutely own to you that standing here on this stage today is terrifying, because I can hear in the back of my mind the clicks, the churns of the online climate denial apparatus moving, and I am afraid saying these things to you, I will open myself up to more attacks. It makes me sick. I'm afraid. But what I am starting to suspect here is that this is not about me, and it's not about glaciers. How can I stand on a TED stage, tell you about science, tell you about glaciers, and tell you about hate all in one breath? What's going on? It's about what this is really about. This is about power. It's about authorizing specific knowledges and marginalizing or excluding others. It pretends to be this single story about glaciers or women or me. But in reality, this is about power. Whoever controls the knowledge controls how you think. So, I've decided that I'm not playing that game anymore. My last thought for you is to please not be horrified that I'm a woman in science getting attacked for glacier research. Be horrified that I'm a human being, and then think about this. There are 400,000 glaciers on this planet. We are losing them, and we know so little about them. I don't want to wait 40,000 years for Voyager 1 to potentially run into an alien species that cares about glaciers and starts asking questions. I want to ask these questions now, because I already know that glaciers are more than the summation of their parts and their processes. And I think glaciers are worth this fight. Frankly, I think we're all worth this fight. Thank you.